So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Anilton, can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great. Looks
Okay,
great.
wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I think Dr. Fanta may be having some issues logging on, but I'll introduce myself and we'll get going. So my name is Will Feldman. I am on faculty in the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital and in Harvard Med School. And I also am on faculty in the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics. The title of my talk today is Inhalers, Patents, the FDA, and Asthma. I have a few disclosures that I want to start with. So I serve as a consultant for Alosa Health, which is a nonprofit organization devoted to evidence-based prescribing. I also served as a consultant to Edion, a pharmacoepidemiology software company. I received an honorarium for a presentation to Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. And I currently serve as an expert witness in litigation against inhaler manufacturers. And I should mention that that litigation actually grew out of some of the work that I'll be talking about today. This work was funded by the Commonwealth Fund and the NIH. So, and I'll just say we'll have some time for questions at the end, but if folks want to ask questions in the middle, I can try to keep an eye on the chat as well. So this is a picture of the very first inhaler approved by the FDA in 1956, the Medihaler. There was a Medihaler ISO and Medihaler Epi, both approved in 1956. It was a product by Rikers. And the sort of history or maybe mythology of the birth of this product was that one of the leaders at Rikers had a daughter who had asthma and asked why her inhaled treatment couldn't come in a bottle like hairspray, and that gave this idea of a meter dose inhaler. And who knows if that is true, but that's the story that ends up getting told. But I put this up because as many of you know very well, inhalers have been around for a very, very long time. Today, there are dozens of inhalers. This was a photo from our clinic at the Brigham. And this was a poster that I remember when I was a first-year fellow in 2017, seeing this and just asking the question that many of us have asked at some point of what is there data to suggest that one of these is better than the other within a given class, and which of these as a new fellow should I be prescribing? And slowly over time, seeing that often patients couldn't afford their inhalers and sort of not quite understanding why they were so expensive if they'd been around for such a long period of time. The first study that I did, and all of these studies we're going to talk about today kind of came out of those questions I was asking as a fellow, and out of that sort of dizzying array of inhalers on the poster. So the first paper that we wrote looked at spending in Medicare Part D on inhalers. Medicare Part D is a great payer to examine because it represents about a third, a little bit more, of retail prescription drug spending in the United States. So a huge chunk of prescription drug spending is through Medicare Part D, and a lot of the data are publicly available. So we just sought to understand how much do we actually spend on inhalers in Medicare Part D, again, representing about a third of the retail prescription drug market or more. And we showed that from 2012 to 2018, spending on inhalers for asthma and COPD rose from $4.5 billion to $6.5 billion. And this is after estimated confidential rebates and discounts. $6.5 billion in 2018 was 5.5% of all net Medicare Part D spending. So I think inhalers don't always get the same play as some other products like EpiPens or insulin in the media, But just to keep in mind that this is a huge chunk of retail prescription drug spending in the United States, just inhalers for asthma and COPD. One reason for high spending, of course, is that these are prevalent diseases. In Medicare, 1 in 9 beneficiaries has COPD and 1 in 20 has asthma. But part of the problem is that inhalers continue to be expensive. The graph on the left shows the cost for a 30-day supply by drug class, and the graph on the right shows the number of inhalers prescribed. And what you can see is that during the study period, the cost per inhaler remained relatively steady. You see that short-acting beta agonists were the cheapest, and followed by inhaled corticosteroids. A lot of the combination products hovered around $200 for a 30-day supply, with triple therapy being introduced late in the study period being a bit more. But in general, it was relatively flat, whereas the number of inhalers prescribed increased pretty dramatically. And that's because there were an increasing number of Medicare beneficiaries in the who were getting coverage through Medicare Part D. You see a particular growth in inhaled corticosteroid long-acting beta agonist combinations and in short-acting beta agonists. And sort of as we wrestled with the implications of this study, perhaps the most surprising thing is that from 2012 to 2018, there were 42 different inhalers on the market, but no true generic products. And the question that we asked was where were all of the generic inhalers? We know from lots and lots of drug pricing research that when you have interchangeable generic versions of a brand name product, that you start seeing prices fall. The more generic competitors you have for a given product, the more prices fall until you get close to the cost of production. But in the case of inhalers, in this study, not a single one had a true independent generic product. So the work that I'm going to be presenting today really gets at this question of why there have been so few generics and what we can do about it. So I'll spend about 20 minutes presenting some work that looked at how inhaler manufacturers have used the patent system to extend market exclusivity on their products. I'll spend 15 minutes describing 2 follow-up studies, one looking at patent challenges and then the other looking at revenue on inhalers. And then we'll spend 10 minutes talking about some of the take-home points, some ideas for reform, and questions. So how have inhaler manufacturers used the patent system to extend periods of market exclusivity? And this is work that was published last year in Health Affairs. I'll start with 3 definitional points. One about patents versus exclusivity, one about drug device combinations, and one about this compendium called the Orange Book. Understanding these definitions will be very helpful to kind of follow the rest of the talk. So first are this distinction between patents and exclusivities. Patents are granted by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, the USPTO. They're 20 years from the time of filing until they expire. And drugs can have multiple patents. Exclusivities are different in that they're granted by the FDA. They vary in time based on the type of approval. So if you have a new chemical entity, you get 5 years. If it's a new formulation, you get 3 years. If you've done a pediatric study, you get an additional 6 months. And these all run concurrently. So for example, if you have a drug that whose patent expires 10 years after approval because it was filed 10 years before approval. So let's say it expires 10 years after approval and you have an exclusivity that is for 5 years because it's a new chemical entity, you have 10 years of market protection. It's not as if you add the 5 plus the 10, they run concurrently. And then drug device combinations, the second definitional point I want to make. So these are products that are sold together with their delivery devices. So think about insulin pens or EpiPens, inhalers, nicotine patches. The drugs are together with the delivery device. And then patents can be given for different aspects of the drug device combination. So I use Spiriva Respimat here as an example. Companies can obtain patents on the active ingredients, so on tiotropium, on the inactive ingredients, the use or the formulation. So these are, we refer to as secondary patents, which are from primary patents, which are on the active ingredients. And then patents on the delivery devices. And we refer to these as tertiary patents, so actually on the Respimat device. And to give you a flavor of the kinds of device patents that are listed, these are 6 different patents that are on the Respimat delivery device. These are separate patents, so a separate patent for a device for producing high pressure. There's a patent on the cartridge for a liquid, on the piston pumping system, on the microstructured filter, the atomizing nozzle, the dose counter, and these are just 6. There are more. And I should say, I'm not picking on the Respimat device in particular here. All of the drug companies kind of do have the same strategy of getting lots and lots of patents on different components of the device. The third definitional point to make is around the Orange Book. So the Orange Book is a compendium released by the FDA each year, and manufacturers have to list all of their key patents with the FDA in the Orange Book. So each product will have a list of all of the key patents that a manufacturer submits to the FDA. And this is hugely important because the FDA cannot approve a generic product of a brand name drug that have active patents listed unless the generic firm challenges the patents. And these patent challenges are known as paragraph 4 certifications. So we'll keep these definitional points in mind as we're going. We talked about patents versus exclusivities, about the different types of patents that we might see on inhalers, and then about how these patents are listed with the FDA in the Orange Book. In this first study, we use the Orange Books each year to identify every inhaler approved by the FDA from 1986 to 2020. We extracted the date of FDA approval, the exclusivities, the date of exclusivity expiration, the patents, and the date of patent expiration for each product and patent and exclusivity. We used a separate database called LexisNexis Total Patent 1 to extract additional information about the patents themselves. And in particular, we categorized patents as being related to the device versus something else, so a non-device patent, and patents that were filed before FDA approval of a product or after FDA approval of a product. The primary endpoints, the primary endpoint was duration of expected protection from direct generic competition. So we just looked at the time from FDA approval until the last to expire patent or exclusivity. And then as a secondary endpoint, we looked at the duration of actual protection. So remember, I just mentioned a minute ago that in some instances, if generic companies challenge patents that are still active and listed in the Orange Book, they may be able to get FDA approval. So we looked at the time from FDA approval in this secondary endpoint until the expiration of patents, the last to expire patent or exclusivity, assuming that there were no approved interchangeable generic competitors. And when there were generic competitors, we stopped at the time of generic approval. So what did we find? There were 62 inhalers approved by the FDA from 1986 to 2020. These had 4 different mechanisms of action: steroid, beta agonist, muscarinic antagonist, and mast cell stabilizer. You'll notice that some of these classes had quite a few products. So in the inhaled corticosteroid class had 15 different brand name inhalers approved. And you'll also note that only 9 of the 62 were generics, 53 were brand name products. Of the generics, there were two generic versions of Advair Discus that were approved in 2019 and 2020, respectively. And then there were several generic versions of albuterol. 4 of these were older CFC-containing products, chlorofluorocarbamide chlorofluorocarbon-containing products. And then the others were more recently approved in 2020. The CFC-containing products, of course, have been removed from the market. So we'll walk through now kind of the 5 big findings, I think, of our study. One is that of the 62 inhalers approved from 1986 to 2020, only one of these had an ingredient with a new mechanism of action, and that was atrivin or ipratropium, approved in 1986. Since then, all of the subsequent approvals have been for the same 4 mechanisms of action that I showed on the previous slide. And of course, ipratropium wasn't even the first muscarinic antagonist in general, but this was the first time that it was given in an inhaler. The second key point is that the number of patents filed before FDA approval was increasing during the study period. So in the first decade, the median number of patents that had been filed at the time of FDA approval was 2, up to 8 in the second decade, and 11 in the last. And then the median number of device patents also increased from 0 to 3 to 7 during the study period. The median protection, the duration of protection available at the time of approval was 15.4 years. And these next 3 slides just walk through in graphic form this idea that there are an increasing number of patents, and in particular, an increasing number of device patents. So you can, among inhalers approved in the mid-80s and through the mid-90s, that we're seeing inhalers with typically less than 5 patents, and many of them had no device patents. In the second decade, in the 2000s, we see a growth in the number of both non-device and device patents. And you start seeing products like, for example, Advair HFA, which was approved in 2006, where the majority of patents at the time of FDA approval were actually on the delivery device. And then the most recent decade, in the 2010s, you see this explosion in the number of patents. And you start seeing products like Combivent Respimat, for example, with that were approved that had only device patents listed at the time of approval. So you see all 25 of Combivent Respimat's patents were on the delivery device. You see something similar for ProAir Respiclick, for QVAR ReadyHaler, where all patents are on the delivery device. The next thing that we found is that there were a lot of patents that were filed after FDA approval. So if a small change is made to the product, for example, a dose counter is added, or a slight tweak to the delivery device, manufacturers can file patents that are put in with the USPTO after FDA approval of product. And we saw this for 25 different inhalers, that patents extended the duration of protection for 12 of these inhalers, and the median time added for these 12 was 5.8 years. And each year of added protection can be worth many millions of dollars, as we'll come to later. The overall median duration of expected protection on these inhalers was 16.2 years. The last to expire patent was a device patent 53% of the time. And then I told you that we looked also at the secondary endpoint of accounting for the fact that some generic products may have come to the market before expiration of patents if they were successful in challenging the patents. And that happened for only one of the 53 brand name inhalers. That was for ProAir HFA. So the median duration of actual protection on the secondary analysis was 15.4 years. And then the final thing, and I think this is kind of the most interesting as we think about strategies that brand name manufacturers have used in limiting generic competition, is this idea of device hopping. So I'll use Combivent as a classic example, but as you'll see in a moment, this is just one of numerous examples. Combivent was approved by the FDA in 1996. The patents on the active ingredients, albuterol and ipratropium, had both lapsed by that point. Albuterol had the patent on the active ingredient expired in 1989, and the patent on ipratropium had expired in 1991. So the original Combivent inhaler was approved in 1996 with one patent that would expire in 2015. And this was on the combination itself, not on the individual ingredients, but on the idea of the combination. That was the patent. There was then a ban on chlorofluorocarbons that all of you are familiar with. So in 1987, 196 countries, including the US, signed the Montreal Protocol to eliminate CFC-containing products. Meter dose inhalers were granted an exemption by regulators in the US. And the phase out of CFC-containing inhalers happened from 2009 to 2013. One of those CFC-containing inhalers was Combivent. The others are listed here. And you can see that there were quite a number of CFC-containing inhalers at the time that the ban went into effect. This turned out to be quite a boon in some ways for generic, for brand name inhaler manufacturers. So in the case of Combivent, the CFC-free version, the Combivent Respimat, was approved in 2011 with 25 patents, all on the delivery device. And at the end of the day, Behringer has had 34 years of protection on its Combivent line. So the first Combivent inhaler that contains CFCs plus the Combivent Respimat, there is continuous patent protection from 1996 to 2030. And of course, there still is no generic Combivent inhaler on the market today. So I promise you that this is not unique to Combivent. In our study, there were 14 different originator inhalers that pursued this strategy, leading to 18 different follow-on brand name products. And when we pull inhaler line, manufacturers received a median of 28.1 years of protection. This compares to what's typical for most drugs, for oral drugs, of 12 to 14 years of patent protection. You see that when you consider both the extensive patenting and the long periods of patent protection on the individual inhalers, and then look at the inhaler lines as a whole, 28.1 years is quite a long time. 8 of the 19 follow-ons were replacing CFC-containing inhalers, but the remainder were not. And so this graph is showing you in blue when the first patent for a given product was filed. The breakpoint with the orange tells you when the individual product was approved, and the end of the orange is when the patents or exclusivities expired. So if you look down to Combivent at the very bottom, you see that there are these overlapping periods where the initial Combivent inhaler and the Combivent Respimat had patent protection, giving it this very long 34-year period of patent protection. But you see something similar with a number with all of the products up here, and many of these again are not related to CFCs. So Advair Discus and Advair HFA is an example with no CFCs. Same for QVAR, same for Foradil, for Spiriva, for ProAir. These are products that didn't have CFCs to begin with. So to summarize this first part of the talk, how are manufacturers using the patent system to preserve their market dominance? They're developing new products in old classes. They're filing an increasing number of patents before FDA approval. They're extending protection through further patents, often on the delivery devices after FDA approval. They're managing to avoid challenges to their patents by generic manufacturers, and they're engaging in this process of device hopping. So the next part of the talk, I'm going to go through 2 follow-up studies that we've done since this first paper. And I just want to make one point here before we move into the follow-up studies. One question I often get at this point is, why can't a generic manufacturer just make a product that, let's say, has these ingredients that have gone off patent. Just have their own inhaler that doesn't infringe on, let's say, the Respimat device, but functions just like the Respimat device. Why can't they just come up, release a product that avoids infringing on the patents and functions the same way? And the answer is that, number one, the FDA has very strict requirements about about the usability of the interchangeable generic. So a generic firm needs to show that their product is used in just the same way as the brand name originator. And so it can be hard to avoid infringing on some of these patents. And the second point is that so long as there are active patents listed in the Orange Book, the only way to get FDA approval for a generic version is to challenge those patents as either invalid, unenforceable, or not infringed. And we'll talk about in this next segment of the talk why that can be challenging. So we'll talk for 10 minutes about patent challenges on inhalers, and then 5 minutes on some recent work looking at revenue. So why aren't generic competitors successfully challenging patents on inhalers? I just showed you how there are all of these patents on inhalers, and it's limiting generic competition. But why aren't generics able to bring forth these challenges to the patents on brand name drugs? In this paper, I should say, was led by a law student at Georgetown who's also a master's student at Harvard Kennedy School, Sanjay Reddy. And it's also, I should mention, this is in press, hasn't yet been released, so please keep this somewhat confidential for now. So the questions that we asked were how frequently generic firms are filing paragraph 4 challenges on inhalers. Again, paragraph 4 challenges are these patent challenges. How long after brand name approval are the challenges being filed? How are brand name firms responding with litigation, and what are the outcomes of litigation? In the typical flow of a patent challenge, to keep in your mind as we talk through some of the data, is a generic firm will file a paragraph 4 challenge at some point after the brand name has been approved. The FDA incentivizes these challenges by giving the first generic firm to file a challenge 180 days of market exclusivity. So that means that no other generic can come to the market in those 180 days. And if you're getting 180 days of exclusivity for a blockbuster drug that has billions in revenue, that 180-day period of exclusivity can be quite valuable. What then happens, so after the generic firm files this patent challenge, the generic firm notifies the brand name firm. And then if the brand name firm files a lawsuit within 45 days of the patent challenge, the FDA grants an automatic 30-month stay where it will not approve the generic drug to allow for the litigation to play out. So the FDA wanted to incentivize if there's going to be a lawsuit, for it to happen quickly so that there's not a delay, so within the first 45 days, but then the brand name firm has a large incentive to actually file a lawsuit because they get 30 months of protection where a generic drug, the generic version of the product, will not be approved. So for this paper, we gathered all of the paragraph 4 certifications from a list that's kept by the FDA. We used the Orange Book again to determine approval dates, to calculate the time from approval to paragraph 4 challenge, and to identify all the patents that were listed at the time of paragraph 4 challenge. And then we searched 4 separate legal databases to find any litigation that had been associated with these paragraph 4 challenges. And again, I'll walk through kind of the main points, but glad to answer questions at the end about any of these more specifics. So we saw 53 brand name inhalers that were approved by the FDA from 1986 to 2020. There were only 7 products that had paragraph 4 certification, so patent challenges before expiration of patents. Those were Proventil, Q-Bar, Spiriva, HandiHaler, Flovin HFA, ProAir HFA, Xopenex HFA, and Symbicort. You'll notice that for Flovin HFA, there were actually separate paragraph 4 certifications on the different strengths, whereas for the other products, it was just one for all of the strengths. And you can see that there was quite a lot of variation in the time from the approval of the brand name drug until the challenge by a generic firm on one or more of the patents. The median duration of time from FDA approval to first paragraph 4 certification was 13.5 years. The brand name firm almost always responded with litigation. So the brand name firm brought litigation in 6 of the 8 challenges. In one case, Flovin HFA, the paragraph 4 happened right before our search. So it might be that, in fact, litigation was filed and is ongoing, but that would be missed by our search. And then there was, in the case of Proventil, there was no litigation filed, in part because the paragraph 4 came so close to the expiration of the patents. So of the products with paragraph 4 certifications, of the 6, there were 9 lawsuits in total, with manufacturers in a couple of instances facing 2 different paragraph 4 certifications. So 9 lawsuits, and brand name manufacturers sued for infringement on 37% of patents listed in the Orange Book that were filed at the time of paragraph 4 certification, and then 31% of patents that had been added after paragraph 4 certification. Of the 26 litigated patents, more than half were on the delivery device, and more than half had filing dates after FDA approval. And what are the outcomes of litigation? This is really the sort of most important piece of this paper, that only 2 of these patent challenges led directly to there being approved generics. A couple in 2 of the cases, the litigation is ongoing. 3 of the lawsuits resulted in settlements, 2 related to ProAir HFA, 1 related to Xopenex HFA. 1 lawsuit resulted in a voluntary dismissal of claims. And then there were 2 that resulted in injunctions against generic firms, 1 in which the generic has been successful in defending against the brand name firm for a lawsuit. But the take home again here is that only in 2 cases, in the case of ProAir, which did so via settlement, and in the case of Symbicort, which did so via the court without a settlement, where the generic was actually successful, only in these 2 cases did patent challenges actually lead to a generic being approved. In all of the other cases, the brand name firms were successful in either settling with the generic firm or getting an injunction to keep them off the market. So for the 53 brand name inhalers that were approved by the FDA from 1986 to 2020, generic inhalers were approved for 4 of the brand name products, 2 from paragraph 4 challenges before patent expiration, and then 2 after patent expiration. I just mentioned ProAir HFA and Symbicort. So Teva, in the case of ProAir HFA, had 15.3 years of market exclusivity before the first generic was approved in 2020. And AstraZeneca, in the case of Symbicort, had 15.7 years of market exclusivity before the first generic competitor was approved in 2022. And then in the case of Advair Diskus and Proventil HFA, in these 2 cases, there were generics that were approved only after patents had expired. In the case of Advair Diskus, GSK had 18.5 years of market exclusivity before the first generic was approved in 2019. And then 3M Candiva had 23.7 years of market exclusivity before the first generic was approved in 2020. And how does this compare to other products outside of the context of inhalers? So this was a study that was put out by several of the people that I have co-authored papers with, but I was not part of this one. So they looked at new generic approvals in 2013 and 2015, nearly 2/3 had paragraph 4 challenges, compared to very few paragraph 4 challenges in our cohort. The challenges were filed a median of 5.2 years after FDA approval, compared to, in our case, they were filed, the median time from brand name approval until paragraph 4 certification was closer to 10, and generic approval occurred for these oral drugs between 11 and a half years after FDA approval, compared to the case of inhalers, which was happening closer to 15 years. So sort of lots of patents on these products that are not being challenged. There are few generic manufacturers that are pursuing paragraph 4 challenges. When they do, they're doing so long after FDA approval. Brand name firms nearly always respond with litigation, and the brand name firms have been effective in extracting settlements or injunctions. And then I'll move to, before I move to the last part, I'll just mention that the open question that has come out of this paper is why is it the case that generic manufacturers have been so unsuccessful in obtaining paragraph 4 certifications? Why aren't they applying for them more frequently and getting and being successful more frequently? One possibility, of course, is that the FDA hurdles for getting drug device combinations approved may be too high. So the FDA has a rigorous set of standards in approving drug device combinations that are different from oral or intravenous drugs. In those cases, generic firms just have to show bioequivalence, and can do so by showing levels of the drug in the blood being equivalent to what is seen in brand name versions. For inhaled medications, of course, that's not possible because the blood concentrations aren't the thing that matters. What we'd really want to know is concentrations in the lungs. And that's been very, very hard to show. So the FDA currently uses what's called a weight of the evidence approach in determining bioequivalence. And some have argued that the bar that they set is simply too high. And regardless of whether it's too high or not, it may be a deterrent for generic firms to seek approval and challenge brand name drugs. One possibility is that some of these products may not be sufficiently lucrative because it's costs money to challenge patents on brand name drugs. It requires that the generic firm believe that there's going to be it will pay off in the end. And some of the inhalers aren't particularly lucrative, though, as we'll see in a moment, a lot of them are quite lucrative. And then the sort of third hypothesis is that it's the patent thickets and prospect of litigation that are too much of a deterrent. That, as we saw in the first part of the talk, brand name drugs, brand name manufacturers are listing tons of patents on their products that they're, in the second part of the talk, we saw that they're litigating any challenge that comes their way, and that those two together make it quite hard for a generic firm to succeed in a paragraph 4 challenge. So in the final part of this talk, I will we'll go through a study that just came out this week, actually, in JAMA, where we looked at manufacturer revenue on inhalers after expiration of primary patent. So how lucrative has all of this been for brand name inhaler manufacturers? For this study, we used 10K filings to the SEC and company annual reports. All publicly traded companies have to submit these filings to the SEC, and then many companies will release annual reports that identify the revenue on their various inhaler lines and other drug product lines each year. So we basically obtained from 2000 until 2021 all of the 10K filings in annual reports that we could for all of the inhalers that had been approved, or for all of the manufacturers of the inhalers that had been approved. And then we used the Orange Book as in the prior studies to determine when the patents on the active ingredients expired. Our focus was really on looking at revenue pre-expiration of primary patents and post-expiration of primary patents, because our patent system is really designed to reward therapeutic breakthroughs, and patent protection on active ingredients is in theory a reward for a therapeutic breakthrough, a new molecule, and that's the sort of thing that in general we think the patent system ought to reward: a new therapy for HIV, a new therapy for hepatitis C. That if we're going to be giving these periods of monopoly, that it should be with new therapeutic breakthroughs, and as opposed to secondary and tertiary patents, when those are all that's protecting a product, when the patent on the active ingredient is expired, it feels like these are kind of less consequential when it comes to innovation. So that's why we looked at pre and post expiration of primary patents. We were able to obtain revenue data from inhalers that represented at least 90% of the US market, we think more. Some of the products, particularly the Behringer products, the data were not available because Behringer is not publicly traded. But we think that we were covering at least 90% of the US market. And during the study period, manufacturers earned $178.1 billion in revenue from 2000 to 2021, $67.2 billion when primary patents were active, $110.3 billion after expiration of primary patents, but with secondary and tertiary patents still active, and then $613 million after all patents had expired. The biggest products during the study period were the Advair inhalers, so the Discus and HFA, that led to $68.2 billion in revenue for GlaxoSmithKline. 38% was before expiration of primary patents and 62% was after. For the Spiriva HandiHaler and Spiriva Respimat, a Behringer product, Behringer took in $30.5 billion in revenue during the study period, most of which was actually before expiration of the patent on tiotropium. 15% came after expiration of the patent. And then the last was Symbicort, an AstraZeneca product, $15.6 billion in revenue, and 100% came after expiration of primary patents, showing you that at the time that Symbicort was approved, the patents on budesonide and formoterol had expired. So there were no primary patents on Symbicort when it was approved. All of the revenue, all $15.6 billion, came after. And then this is a graph showing you over time this ratio between all of the revenue earned when primary patents were active versus the revenue that was earned after primary patent expiration. And you can see that in the 2000s, that most of the revenue was actually when products had primary patents active. And then you start to see these patents expiring, but continued revenue because of secondary and tertiary patents that continued, that peaked in 2013 but continues to today. So I'll close in these last several minutes with some take-home points, some ideas for reform, and I would love questions, because I think when I present this material, particularly to a group of pulmonologists, it's always interesting conversations. I'd love to hear what questions folks have or points folks want to make. The take-home points for me of the material that we've gone through so far are that there's very limited generic competition on inhalers because of extensive patenting, few successful paragraph 4 challenges, and this current scheme has been very profitable for drug manufacturers. We've proposed a series of reforms. This set that I'll go over here is by no means exhaustive, but we think that fixing these would lead to more generic competition, which in turn would lower prices and lead to better access for our patients. So the first reform would be at the USPTO itself. One way to limit this practice of over patenting would be to grant fewer patents and really focusing on ensuring that only high quality patents are issued in the first place. Some have proposed having special units that are just devoted to pharmaceuticals at the USPTO, or having a second layer of review for prescription drugs. Others have proposed more time and resources and specialized training for patent examiners, all with the goal of making sure that we only have high quality patents issued. Another set of reforms that I think would be quite valuable would be to grant periods longer than 180 days for paragraph 4 certifications on complex drug device combinations like inhalers. So currently the incentives for an oral pill are the same as for a complex product like an inhaler, even though producing the latter, an inhaler, is much more challenging in terms of the manufacturing than an oral pill. So we think that the exclusivity periods granted should correspond with the level of difficulty in bringing a generic to market. And conversely, we would, or sort of alongside the increase in the incentives for generic firms, we think it would be valuable to reduce the incentive for brand name firms to litigate by reducing this automatic 30-month stay that they get whenever they litigate a paragraph 4 certification. A third category of reform would focus on the Orange Book. So as mentioned a few times during the talk, the Orange Book is key for all of this because the FDA can't approve products, generic versions, when patents are listed in the Orange Book. So we could preclude the listing of device patents in the Orange Book. And this is an area of ongoing litigation over what types of patents should be listed in the Orange Book. But the FDA currently doesn't police what gets listed. The manufacturers choose, as long as it's related to the drug product, and manufacturers have chosen to list device patents, even though that's being contested now. Another idea would be to allow manufacturers to add patents to the Orange Book after approval only if these new patents represent some kind of meaningful clinical benefit, because a lot of the patents that are protecting brand name inhalers have been added late in the game after they were approved. And then finally, more USPTO and FDA collaboration. The FDA and USPTO announced this past year ongoing efforts to collaborate more, which we think is wonderful. This could mean more FDA training for patent examiners, ensuring that what manufacturers are saying to the FDA are consistent with what they're saying to the USPTO. And there are a number of other ideas that have been proposed, all related to having the two bodies collaborate more. So I will stop now. We have about 9 minutes left for questions, but I just want to acknowledge the Commonwealth Fund and the NIH for funding this work, my research group, the Program on Regulation, Therapeutics, and Law, which is housed within the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics. Also the folks in the Pulmonary and Critical Care Division who've been very supportive of all of this work, and then many wonderful co-authors on these projects. So thank you so much for being here, and happy to answer questions.
Well, big apologies from me from joining late, and I do want to share a couple of questions that appeared in the chat, if I could, with you. I'm not sure if you can see them, but one was actually sort of a comment about how difficult it is for a company that wanted to take old drugs and put it into a new formulation in terms of the cost of clinical trials, marketing, distribution, and then competing with the marketing of established large companies, that it seems like such a high barrier to entry.
Yes, and the barrier is high, no question. So for a company to develop the capacity to produce generic inhalers, there's no question that it's harder than an IV drug or an oral drug. I will say that sort of mitigating against the difficulty is number one, when the FDA is approving generic inhalers, it's true that it requires more than what's required for an oral drug, but it's much less than what's required for a new brand name approval. So it's still the case that you can perform different in vivo and in vitro studies showing bioequivalence, and you do typically need some human trials, but these are much smaller trials than the massive trials that we see for new brand name approvals. And then in terms of the marketing, one very good thing about the US prescription drug system is that once you get generic competition on the market, all 50 states have automatic substitution laws. And so some have mandatory substitution, some have permissive substitution. But even if the maker of Wixela, which is the new, one of the now few generic Advair Discus versions, without any marketing, it's still getting automatically substituted in most states. And so Advair Discus, as soon as the generic came on, the first one, it's been a rapid decline in market share. So I totally agree that there are a lot of barriers, but they're not insurmountable, and they can be quite lucrative for the generic firms because of this substitutability.
The assumption is that a new generic version will be less expensive. But Symbicort being an example, what's the relationship? We were wondering, and the question came into the chat about the role of insurance companies and their insistence, no, you need the brand, or no, you need the generic. And is it always clear that the generic, like Wixela, will be significantly cheaper?
Yes. So great question. And I'm just also looking at the chat, and these are really wonderful to chat about. So I just want to make one point of clarification about this Symbicort example. So I didn't give you this distinction in the talk, but there's a distinction between authorized generics and independent generics. Symbicort does have an authorized generic, but authorized generics are approved and or marketed by the brand name firm. So AstraZeneca sells an authorized generic of Symbicort, but the independent generic of Symbicort that's been approved it's caught up in litigation. It was approved in 2022, and it hasn't, at least when I looked a week or two ago, hasn't actually hit the US market. And there have been a lot of studies showing that when a company releases an authorized generic, that's absolutely right, that there are all of these formulary these formulary moves. So it might be that the authorized generic has a lower list price and even a lower net price, but the companies in negotiating with the insurers will say only the brand name Symbicort is actually going to be on, that's the only one we're going to cover. And one reason that they do that is that the people doing the negotiation for the payers, the PBMs, like big rebates. So this gap between the list price and the net price, and it can be a reason why they want to favor the brand name version of Symbicort as opposed to the authorized generic. So that's one huge point, and that's right. And then even beyond authorized generic, so Wixela is a true independent generic, but I've also seen similar reports of different insurers not covering the generic version, which is problematic. And so this substitutability might be substitutable, but when the patient learns that the costs are going to be higher because it's not covered, then they end up with the brand name. So I think that's absolutely right. The dream in our prescription drug system for generics is that you end up with 5 or 6 or 10 different generic manufacturers. And that's what you see with statins or with other drugs that were once expensive and are now very cheap. You see 5 to 10 generic manufacturers competing, and the prices come down pretty markedly once you're seeing lots of generic competition. But these generic ICS LABAs have only recently come out, and I think it's going to be time before we start seeing an accumulation of more generics.
Can you explain a little more about authorized generics? What's the motivation to a company, and what's the benefit for someone?
Yeah, so the motivation is, number one, it allows the brand firm to compete with new generics that may be coming onto the market. So GSK has an authorized generic of Advair Diskus that can compete with Wixela, and Teva has a version that was just approved. So it's a way to compete at this lower price point with generics. In some cases, it can be a PR move. So some of the insulin manufacturers released authorized generics to say, look, we have much lower. These are lower prices, which again can be good PR. And then a final thing, and I didn't get into this with all of the litigation, but sometimes brand name firms and generic firms that are challenging the brand firms will enter into a settlement and resolve litigation by making the generic firm an authorized generic. So the brand firm continues to get some revenue from the product because they have authorized it, but it doesn't have to get through all of the hoops, the same kind of hoops at the FDA.
Can we take one more comment or question? Well, it was a statement that very few inhaled drugs have draft guidelines from the FDA to how to go about developing a generic version.
Right. Yes, that is true and is changing. The FDA has been trying to release draft guidance quickly, but that's absolutely right. That I think the draft guidance for Advair Diskus didn't come out until something like 2013. So the generic firms don't even know exactly what's going to be required of them in order to get approval. And I think it's an interesting angle that we haven't yet explored to understand the timing of the draft guidelines as compared to FDA approval of the brand version, and how that's influencing generics entering the market. But it's because it's so complex, and the guidelines for a dry powder inhaler are going to be very different from a metered dose inhaler or soft mist inhaler. So the FDA is very focused on product specific guidelines to get these generics onto the market.
Great. I think it's 9 o'clock. I think we need to thank you for a terrific presentation and insights into this complex world.
Well, thank you
so much,
Will.
Will.
Thank you guys. Thanks for coming.